All right, so our last presentation of the afternoon and of the symposium, for that matter, is going to be by Dr. Conor Shea. Conor is a civil engineer who specializes in hydraulics and geomorphology for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Arcata. He applies that work to develop aquatic habitat restoration projects. I think he identifies largely with the coastal program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He's worked for government agencies, private consulting firms, and in academic settings. He provides technical assistance to a variety of partners that includes local and state government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and private landowners. His work includes all phases of restoration project development, from site assessment, monitoring, and concept development to preparing full construction plans and supervising construction. Conor earned a BS in Forest Engineering and a Master's in Water Science Engineering from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and a Ph.D. in Fluvial Geomorphology from the Johns Hopkins University. Conor's worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service since 2003. He and his wife, who's also an engineer and geomorphologist and actually in the restoration field, moved to Fieldbrick, California in 2007. They live in a redwood forest at the headwaters of Lindsay Creek, and in wet years, they sometimes get lucky enough to watch coho salmon spawning in their stream. Conor and his wife get great satisfaction from their work restoring streams and marshes throughout Northern California. Let's welcome Conor, who's going to talk about the paradigms and evolution of our channel form in the Trinity River.
Well, you must all be happy that I'm the last one to speak. I get to take advantage of everything that everyone else has said so far. So what I'm going to be talking about is, this talk has changed around a couple times since I agreed to do it, but talking about how paradigms of how we view channel form should be for a restored river have changed over time since we started working on, since the period of the rod. What I want to talk about is, just go through the evolution of thought about how we view the channel. That's what a paradigm is. It's how we look at things, how we envision. It's the archetype of how we think the river should be formed. And I want to talk about how that's changed over time, and then discuss the constraints that we have discovered on achieving that desired condition, that form, that archetype of the perfect river that's going to be great for salmon. And then from that, I want to talk about, move forward, is like, what have we learned so far? What are the implications for moving forward with design? Now, I have to point out that I'm covering 20 years, 25 years of work by a great variety of great scientists who've worked very hard on this. And disclaimer, I may mischaracterize some of their thoughts, and during the discussion, we'll have a chance for rebuttal. So I also had to throw this one in. I think this is very, Heraclitus said this in about 500 BC. I don't think he was thinking about the Trinity River at that time, but he could have been. I think this is very true about all of us in this room. We've, the quote is, no person ever steps in the same river twice, or it's not the same river and they are not the same person. And that's really goes to our learning process about working with the river. A lot of us have came in here with our views. We've tried our ideas. We've seen things happen. We've made monitoring. It's changed our decision. And it changes how we view the river, how we think things operate. So it's very appropriate. So I'm going to start discussing where we were at the time of the flow evaluation study. And the flow evaluation study was an amazing piece of work. I was discussing with Sarah how very few river systems have such a foundational document that documented what had happened to the river, had looked at the hydrology, and looked at how it interacted with the fisheries. So at that time, in the flow evaluation study, there was a characterization of what they thought the river looked like before disturbance by mining and by development and by the dam. And it was viewed that the river had been originally a mixture of bedrock channels and alluvial reaches, that there was extensive naturally built floodplains across the valley floor from valley wall to valley wall, and that the river was unconfined within those wide valleys where, and there are areas where there are canyons where the valley walls are very close together, but there are also areas where the valley walls are very far apart, and that the river had occupied and moved back and forth across those wide valley floors. The typical channel form that was envisioned for the river at that time was what we would call a pool-riffle sequence. This is a sequence of alternate bars where we have channels meandering from the left side to the right side and back in a sinuous pattern. It's a kind of a low gradient stream. It develops a lot of habitat, very important for salmoniid rearing. The mining impacts, of course, when you looked at them, they destroyed all those floodplains and terraces. So basically, one way or the other, dredging or placer mining, the entire valley floor was disturbed, disrupted, and turned upside down. The stream was often moved to the side to the valley wall. At that, the conclusion that they had at the flow evaluation study is that even after that mining impact and before the dam, there was still power within the river to start meandering back and forth. So, and again, I think we've heard this story from several speakers. Post-dam, the flows were greatly reduced, and originally down to 20% for about a 20-year period. At that time, there was impacts noted, and the water flows were increased to about 35% of the total flow coming into the reservoirs. And what we saw was happened is that the bed coarsened below Lewiston Dam, which is typical of dams. You cut off the gravel supply, you still have water releases. It's going to move the mobile sediment out of the reach, which isn't replaced. Overall, we lost the ability to transport some of that coarse sediment, and the alternate bars that were there in portions of the river became fossilized because of riparian vegetation and the lack of renewal of high flows to strip the bars out and move them around. So the planform became stabilized for riparian encroachment. The floodplains that were there, that were active before the dam, were abandoned. They were no longer accessed by the river. The channel actually deepened a little bit. It became, the riparian berms narrowed the width, so we decreased the width-depth ratio. And because we're isolating what flow we had into a smaller channel that was deeper with less roughness elements, the flow velocities increased. So really what this describes is a conversion to from a meandering system of alternate bars into a plain bed channel form. So this is a diagram from the flow evaluation study, and it's kind of an idealized version of what they envisioned the channel looked like in the floodplain before the dam occurred and possibly before the mining. But you see that we have low flows confined to a small channel, but because of that sloping bank, meandering channel creation, we have lots of floodplain access. And in low flood years, the water would get out a little bit, but really high flood years, the water could get out all the way up onto the terraces from wall to wall. And so you had a zone of disturbance near the channel, which was turned over by erosion and by river action, where willows and other vegetation did not establish, but were scoured out. But then as you move farther away from the channel, you would have more and more established wetland vegetation, and then getting into the uplands, you would have the conifers. So this is the picture of what happened after the dam. The riparian berms that James just discussed moved in, confined the channel to a smaller channel, and then all that flow energy that was available from the smaller flows was focused on the bed, because the banks became resistant to erosion. So to dissipate energy, the river started to move all the mobile gravel out of the system. So I'm going to get in trouble here because I'm talking about John's work that he did with Dave Montgomery, but this is the Montgomery and Buffington conceptual model of how river or channel forms are spaced across the the slope range of slopes found in mountain rivers. So really what I want to point out here is that we have two types of channels down near the low sloped areas that are in the range of a fluvial system. That's the pool riffle and the plain bed channels. They're kind of adjacent, and in this diagram, they're shown as separate across the landscape, very separate divisions. But there's, as John was talking about earlier, there's an intermix there. They can overlap in slope ranges depending on the local conditions. So if we compare the typical characteristics of what we think are plain beds with pool riffles, and again, this is from John's work, we find that the plain beds have slightly rougher channels. They tend to have larger sediment on the bottom because they're slightly higher energy systems. There are basically no bars in this system, whereas a pool riffle system will have lateral oscillations, and those lateral oscillations help form, in a pool riffle system, form the bars, and those bars and bed forms are actually roughness elements that slow down the flow. In a plain bed channel, we don't have those features. So the roughness elements are composed of individual grains, which might be as large as boulders, but just might be the cobble and gravel making up the bed, and then the bank resistance as friction moving along the bank. Where does sediment come from these channels? Well, in both cases, it's from fluvial delivered sediment from upstream and from bank failures. More probably with the meandering channel, we have more bank erosion, so we're going to get a larger fraction of our material from reworking material from floodplain deposits. And that's indicated by where sediment is stored. If sediment gets taken out of a plain bed channel, it's pushed up onto the overbanks, and that's a lot of what we see. In a meandering system, we'll have sediment stored in the bars within the channel where it's available, or up on the overbanks. And so the pool riffle systems are generally unconfined, so that they can move side to side. The plain beds may be confined, they might be unconfined. But the other thing that comes into play here is just the idea of the energy. So for typical slopes for these plain bed systems are a little bit higher than what we would see for pool riffle systems. And if we look at the range of slopes that are found within the Trinity River program reach, we see that they're pretty, they're up in the range of above 2%. And, in order to lower this down to a range that would be more typical for pool riffles, we would have to increase the sinuosity by quite a bit. So the natural prevalence here is that because of the way the system was confined, we're moving towards a plain bed system. So again, this is a kind of a conceptual diagram from John's work, and what really this lays out is the idea of where pool riffles and plain bed channels are within the system. So we're in an area that has a lowered capacity to move material, but has enough material that there's material available for transport. So we're right at this cusp between supply limited, where we have more energy than sediment, and an area of transport limited, where we have plenty of material, but not enough energy to move it. And this can be represented by this ratio QR, which is the sediment supply divided by the capacity to move the sediment. And in the plain bed and pool riffle systems, we're going to find that those values will generally be pretty close to 1, or approximately 1, basically in balance. Now, if they're not in balance, if it's either lower or higher, the channel is going to make adjustments. So if there's too much energy, the channel will try to erode until that excess energy is dissipated. If there's too much sediment, the channel will try to move that sediment until it spreads it out, and it has the ability to transport it. So the whole point of that, going into that discussion, is that there was a lot of drivers post-dam that pushed the channel from a possibly meandering system, plain beds, towards plain bed. We had a reduction in sediment supply. There was a loss of stream power because the discharge had been so much reduced. The encroachment of the into the bars, the active bars, reduced the channel sinuosity, probably steepened the slope a bit. On top of this, even before the dam, a lot of the channel sections were confined by bedrock and mine tailings. And then with the riparian encroachment, that increased the bank strength by rooting into the banks, which made it less susceptible for bank erosion. So that increased bed erosion of the mobile sediment on the bed. And eventually, over time, that mobile sediment and the fines were stripped out and the channel bed armored. So we became not only lost fines and the mobile gravel, but the gravel that was left behind became harder to move. So at the time of the flow evaluation study, they made recommendations. They wanted to convert the channel back from a straight plain bed system into more of a meandering system. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The meandering system has a lot more flow diversity, flow velocity diversity, so that's better habitat for fish. There's shallow areas. There's, just a much more habitat productive for raising juvenile salmonids. So some of the actions that were recommended were that the bank rehabilitation projects, where we would remove the riparian berms, try to induce more meandering and creation of alternate bars. There was also suggestions to create off-channel habitats, as the side channels, and it was recognized at that time that the deltas were a problem because they were areas where sediment came in from the deltas and was trapped and was not made available to move downstream. And there was also recommendations for augmenting sediment. And again, the idea of moving from a plain bed back to a pool riffle system was the idea that this would be a significant improvement in habitat. Now, at the time, this was you have to remember this was at the end of the 90s. The idea of stream restoration had really only been begun, large-scale stream restoration efforts, around 1990. And this was still a very young and evolving field. So going through time, the ROD was signed, TRRP came into existence. The program started doing rehabilitation projects. And, based on the initial set of projects and observations of flow, it was realized that there was maybe some of the original ideas in the flow evaluation study weren't exactly correct. The big finding, this was sort of documented in the channel rehabilitation design guidelines that came out in 2011. Great document, very, very well thought out. The rod flows, I realized at that time, the rod flows probably had limited ability to induce channel migration. And that was because it was found that the flows weren't moving as much sediment as originally thought. And also the realization that the banks were much more resistant to erosion. The other thing that started to be realized that the channel evolution processes were limited because the material in the bed and the material on the banks were much more resistant to movement, especially the banks and the floodplains were filled with large mining tailings that were just not mobile under any conditions. It was also the role of bedrock became better identified as we started moving forward, and we started realizing that many of the features that we liked that supported habitat, holding pools, and so on, were created by where the flow interacted with the valley wall, where there was exposed bedrock, and would scour out material and create complex velocity fields, deep pools, and a lot of complexity in the system. It was also started to realize that really the channel was not possibly the central tendency of the channel was not for a meandering system, but more of a mixed system of straight channels and active meanders, and what was called passive meanders. And these are the meanders that are created by these expansion zones. So if we come out of a tight channel or a canyon and open up, we get an area where material will deposit, and that's where these past meander bars form, and those actually tend to form in the same spot. They do evolve a little bit over time, but they're not moving meanders. So the recommendations that came out of the guidelines was kind of a move from going from this alternate bar model to more of an idea of complex channel form. And this was to incorporate local controls on flow that could, where flow could interact with obstructions or bedrock to create features and hydraulic complexity in the flow. It was also understood that they needed to evaluate sediment supply at the local level rather than on the broad level. And this kind of goes to the idea that realization that the river wasn't just a huge conveyor, that there was areas where there were sources and areas where there were traps. This also at the time also adjusted the idea that we needed to redesign the channel to match up with the flow regime that would occur with the rod. So this is called, at the time, it's gone through a couple of different names, but we're talking about downsizing the channel or refitting the channel to the rod flows. There was also, as time moved forward, the realization that this wasn't a totally alluvial system, that it was semi-alluvial and bedrock controlled. Adrian Krause, Andreas Krause, who worked for the project for several years as the geomorphologist, did a lot of great investigations into how the channel looked like based on the available documentary evidence, and really kind of rewrote the story of how things evolved over time. And some of the findings that Andreas developed really came to influence a lot of the thinking about how we approach the rehabilitation projects. Big one is that we found that the lower valleys were really buried in immobile mining debris. So even though we had a wide valley floor, it was covered by alluvial debris from the mining that couldn't be moved by the river. This actually, even though we had wide valleys in the lower river, the channel was actually very confined by this mining debris. And then it was also a better realization of what the dredging impacts were on the channel form in the upper river, and how the river couldn't really interact with those surfaces or material. So, a lot of the rehabilitation projects originally had the idea that we could direct flow into these immobile surfaces and that they would erode quickly over time. But it became to realize that those surfaces were pretty resistant to river flows. So I think also at this time, this is where Dave's work started to come into play, and we started to realize that the gravel augmentation would be beneficial, but only have localized benefits. We had a phase 1 review that took several years to go through, but there were a lot of recommendations in this about how to run the program, how to do design. But the two that I thought were interesting for channel rehabilitation this was by the CH2ML team, was that one is that we should immediately create as much target habitat as possible. But at the same time, we should also design and implement projects that are self-sustaining and, where possible, trigger future changes. So this gets into the argument of, like, do we build habitat now, or do we build process that then builds habitat? And the recommendations we had was to do both. So moving forward, Dave Guyman led a team of Robert Stewart and Todd Buxton, and they developed this idea of the river corridor management strategy. And this is a really great report. Just reading through it the last couple of days, it's aged very well. A lot of the ideas in the report are still very, very appropriate. Some of the findings, and again, this is my interpretation of what I thought was important about this report, was the recognition that the dredge spoils are acting as an armor layer, in both on the floodplain and in the channel, and that limits the ability of river processes to reshape the channel and floodplain. The other idea is that if we're trying to restore the floodplain by natural processes, these armored floodplains are going to take a very long time for the material to be resorted by river processes and to be reformed by deposition of alluvial materials. This is what we would call a genetic or naturally formed floodplain. It would take geologic time. We're worried about trying to save the salmonids in the short period. So that becomes kind of that conflict of build it now or wait for process to do it. Floodplain development is going to occur by overbank deposition, and we can't rely on channel migration to reform that habitat. We're just not able to create channel migration with the current conditions. So some of the ideas that came, again, endorsed into the rehabilitation strategies was we needed to create more force features. In other words, direct the river against obstacles that then create scour around it and create a complex flow field and create erosive material that then can be picked up by the river and increase the sediment supply. This is also kind of the idea of interacting with the valley wall where possible, where we could create these different conditions. Want to create functional floodplains. I think at this point, we thought of floodplains as being surfaces that we can flood and where the fish can occupy. But if that's just flooding the surface, that's not making a floodplain. And this is a theme that comes up a lot in later reports is we need to use more wood to create this hydraulic complexity that we can't get from river form itself. And another important idea here is that the river, our program Reach the 40 miles, is actually a composite of many different types of geomorphic settings. And the river corridor management strategy identified a strategy for 24 subsets reaches of that river and how each one should be treated individually. So where we are, I think, today is that I think there's this understanding that the channel is always semi-alluvial. It has a lot of hard constraints on its movement, the bedrock, the mining tailings, also the urban development. So our ability for the river to move and do stuff is limited by the lack of what's come to be termed process space. This is the area where alluvial force and river forces have the capability of reshaping the alluvial corridor. A lot of our alluvial space, process space, is really contracted by immobile bedrock, highways, mining tailings, urban development, what have you. So we have limited flow strength and sediment supply in the upper reaches, meaning that we don't have a lot of ability to manipulate stuff with the river. The floodplains, a lot of the floodplains are immobile. They can't be moved by the river. And so our rehabilitation actions should focus on channel realignments that increase sinuosity and complexity. Now, and we should look to be creating constructed bars. And this is a lot, these are elements that are in a lot of the projects that have been built recently. We're creating more force features. We're doing floodplain lowering to create more access at lower flows, probably trying to push the wood loading a little bit more, and still creating some off-channel habitat features. So where I wanted to end up is kind of this getting back to this question of building habitat now or restore process. And I have to say that many of the people I work with are probably biased towards the restore process. The idea that the best way for a river to restore itself is to use the processes of the river to reestablish or reshape the river so that the processes that form the river are active and form the types of river that we want. So pros, I was going through the slide, and building habitat now obviously has the advantage of making habitat available now. It's a predictable outcome. We're working within a managed river. So we don't, it's difficult to have surprises when you build, spend a couple of million building the project. You want the outcomes to be somewhat what you expect to have happen. But the problem with that is it's a little bit of a con, though. It's you're building to a static condition, a stable system. And the other thing we've noticed is that with studies is that we've had in these rehabilitation projects, we get an immediate significant increase in habitat. But then over time, there's a little bit of decay and drop off. And some of this is due to deposition. Some of this is due to loss of off-channel features. It's something that we need to look at. And it's possible that this is something that needs to be revisited and rebuilt over time, because we are in a managed system where we control the flows and sediment. On the restore process size, really that's really good for long-term sustainability. It's more resilient to climate change, having the river build itself. The river corridor can then adjust to sediment supply and the changes in flow regime. And alluvial built features are probably more stable in the sense that they're better floodplains. They're more in keeping with the natural system. And again, the cons on this is that well, that's great. We might not get the habitat that we need right away. Having a really dynamic river corridor in a managed river system might not be appropriate. I know a lot of local residents would be concerned about that. Highways, bridges, so on. And again, it gets to the question, if we have a heavily altered river corridor like the Trinity with so much mining impacts with regulated flows, are natural processes appropriate for that corridor? And again, that's a question. Hopefully we'll bring that up in the discussion. I want to close out too with the phase 2 review. Basically had similar ideas to throw out here. And I pulled out this one segment of the phase 2 review, which I thought was appropriate, where they divided the restoration reaches, rehabilitation sites into 3 categories. And the first category was what they called gardening, which would be build habitat now, where there's very little potential for the systems to evolve on their own because of valley confinement. The second one was river corridor reconstruction, where we had partially confined areas. And what's interesting about this is they placed the Oregon Gulch project not in this category, but in the unconfined area. But I would say that the Oregon Gulch project probably started out in this partially confined system. And the big thing was with the removal of the mine tailings, that moved that system from a confined into an unconfined, or at least lower confined system. So, and then making a rotable corridor, a fully process-based system restoration in areas where there was low confinement. But that can only occur if the confinement is not just the valley walls, but the floodplain doesn't confine the channel as well, that the floodplain would be mobile. And a lot of areas, we still have that problem that the floodplains are relatively immobile and movable by the flows we have available with the rod. So this is kind of where I've ended up my recommendations based on going through this review. I think that, first off, our designs are better now because we have a better understanding of the constraints and controls that form the geomorphology and processes in our rehabilitation areas and can better predict the outcomes. I think as we move forward, I think we've moved in this direction. Oregon Gulch, again, an example, is we're creating process space, a river corridor wide enough so the alluvial processes can occur. We should be thinking about rehabilitating floodplains so that they can be activated by floods, not just scraping down to a surface to flood it so that the fish can get out. Again, we should be looking to remove immobile portions of the bed and bank materials and create room for these dynamic adjustments. Again, we're all, I think, on board with the idea that each particular rehabilitation site is going to have individual potentials and area, where things can be done and make improvements made of a certain type, whereas other areas like such as the canyons are going to have limited potential. Something we don't do, which is very kind of tricky for a rehabilitation project, is to allow for dynamic adjustments after we finish a rehabilitation project. We should, possibly set up, if we want to recreate floodplains, maybe we should lower floodplains extensively, knowing that they're going to be filled in by the next big flood. And I'll probably get this wrong, but that's sort of what happened with the Dark Gulch project, where we lowered the river confinement and ended up spreading out a really nice bed of material. And as Dave pointed out, maybe we should be thinking about lowering the size of the sediment that we add to the river to make it more mobile, and increase it, allow it to move not just from the local area, but make it more active so that it can move further downstream and interact. So with that, discussion. Questions?